But we begin with the first hope for 5 years in Yemen, where millions stand on the brink of famine. A ceasefire has been agreed in Sweden for the Red Sea port used for the aid that most Yemenis need to survive. The warring sides are to pull back from the port and adjacent city by Wednesday if the deal holds. This is a rare chink of light in the current news cycle, which has exhausted listeners to Radio 4. Saudi Arabia, which buys weapons from the UK and others, leads a coalition against rebels in the country. We asked for a briefing on Yemen through 3 objects from Dr. Elisabeth Kendall from Pembroke College, Oxford, and she began with reaction to this news.
It's more than we dared hope for. This really has been a breakthrough in Sweden, not just because a ceasefire was agreed for this vital port of Hodeidah through which most of the aid is imported, but just to get the Houthi delegation to the talks and to keep them there, to keep both sides there for an entire week.
Do you think we'll ever know what happened to bring these people together?
I think several things aligned. One, of course, was the growing international pressure, and that has to be attributed to the appearance across TV screens and in newspapers of starving children. Something really had to happen in order to prevent mass starvation. And also a loss of trust and confidence in the Saudi-led coalition, much of that driven by the various stories that came out of Saudi Arabia over the Khashoggi murder. It meant that there was a lot less trust in Saudi's narrative of the war in Yemen and a lot less goodwill to just let it carry on.
Let's turn to a briefing from you on ways to understand the conflict through the country's history. First of all, you've kindly agreed to talk to us about objects, but let's start with an inanimate object, language. How can we understand Yemen past and present through languages?
The languages of Yemen are not just Arabic. They are actually quite a rich mosaic, particularly in the east of the country. There are still 6 what we call modern South Arabian languages, and 3 of them are very heavily spoken in the east of Yemen. Those are Mehri, Socotra and Hobyut. Yemen is a much richer tapestry than simply this land within borders that we recognise today. Previous to the 1990 unification of Yemen, it was 2 countries. It was the north of Yemen and the south of Yemen. And that fault line is still at work today. But right up until the end of the 1960s, it was still a collection of smaller sultanates and sheikdoms in the south and an imamate in the north. So what this tells us is that there are a lot of little pieces with their own culture, their own way of life and their own ambitions that somehow have to be brought into this overarching state.
And one of the languages you mentioned there, Socotra, is it correct that the island off Yemen that shares the name is known as the Galapagos of the Arabian Sea?
That's right, because it has all sorts of flora and fauna which are unique to Socotra, probably most famously the dragon's blood tree. But actually, many of these areas around the south and it's in the east of Yemen are quite distinctive, and they have their own tribal laws and tribal governance, which is going to be very difficult to bring into these overarching peace talks, which are, after all, only at the moment between the 2 main warring sides.
And this takes us, I think, to number 2 on the list. We'd like to talk to you about the colourful abaya. What is the abaya? Who wears it? And what does it mean?
Today, the abaya is recognised all around the Arab world as this long black robe that covers women from head to toe. And in some parts of the Arab world, they will also cover their faces, either with a black cloth or a mask. But in traditional tribal areas in Yemen, you can find women wearing a colourful version of that, which is much less rigid. And it's much more comfortable for a hot desert climate. I've worn it myself when I've been travelling around the east of Yemen. It's like a huge sheet with a little cutout for the head, and it just dangles over you, much longer at the back than at the front, so that when you're walking around, it gives the impression that you're in a robe trailing behind you. So it's quite glamorous, and the headscarf that goes with it is much looser. It's just thrown around the hair. It's not pinned right up to your scalp, and your face is uncovered. So this is a much different version from the normal picture we get in the media.
Also, of course, there's something that the Salafists and the Saudis are strict about. So this is seen as a liberal gesture to show your face as a woman is something which probably annoys the mullahs.
This is something that's therefore dying out, and you do normally only see this now in the deserts. Down in the coastal towns in the east of Yemen and around Yemen, you see women now wearing full black. But interestingly, it doesn't mean that women have been less active in society. Let me give you an example. In January this year, after Saudi Arabia moved military material into the east of Yemen, along with that came proposals for a new Salafi centre. And the women were livid about it. They protested in droves, chanting and shouting and sitting in and holding banners saying no to all this extremism that's coming to our areas. And that's quite an unusual sight for us in Western Europe, because we would probably assume that women covered head to toe in black with their faces covered were themselves extremists, and that's very far from the truth.
Let's go to the third and final object to tell us about Yemen. You've picked an incense burner.
Thousands of years ago, incense burners were used. We know that because we've unearthed them and they've got inscriptions in ancient Semitic languages. They were mostly used for religious purposes, and we found dedications to local gods that predate Islam on them. But today, it's still used, and it's because it's so important in these southern Arabian cultures to smell nice. And of course, you're burning one of their most ancient and revered and valued products, frankincense, which is still harvested today, just as it was about 3,000 years ago, by carefully cutting the bark and waiting for the resin to run out and then harden. And what this tells us is that they're not able to wash their clothes in the same way that we can just put on a washing machine. And so it's much more important that you get yourself smelling nice by burning this incense around your home. Even when I've travelled in the east of Yemen, women have come up to me and lifted up my headscarf, shoved an incense burner in my face so that it wafts up through my robes and my headscarf. It's just a sign of hospitality, although it can be a bit disconcerting the first time it happens.
Well, it's a very seasonal incense for you to be telling us about, frankincense as well. And finally, yes. Will you allow the BH team to offer you an object in return? You've given us 3. So it would be for our listeners, however many there are, who fought in Aden and might have a medal bearing Queen Elizabeth's face on it, reminds us of the British involvement in this region. How would you judge the British role now, and is it important? Do you accept our object in reply?
I accept your object in reply, but we must remember that even back in the 1960s, it was a revolutionary movement that pushed the British out of Yemen. It would be great if we can help to make up for some of our colonial past by helping Yemen out of its impasse today. We have a slight contradiction, though, in the British role. While we are the pen holders at the United Nations Security Council and have penned a resolution on Yemen, which may, if it's passed, help to entice the warring parties even further down the road of peace. At the same time, we do continue selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which are being used, whether intentionally or not, against civilians. So it would be good if we came down on the side of the former and a bit less on the side of the latter.
Dr. Elisabeth Kendall, Yemen in 3 objects and one of our own.